and welcome back to The Movies Made Us Do It. Happy New Year and all of that stuff. Hello, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, sir. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very, very much looking forward to covering today's film. One of my favorites, The Time Machine.
Yep.
The 1960 movie by director George Pal. When did you first see this movie?
I honestly don't know.
Oh, interesting.
Remember, but it would have been when I was incredibly young.
Yes, same.
So it would have been one of the really early movies I saw on I imagine, on telly.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine it would have been probably a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, certainly.
Job. But yeah, I honestly don't remember the first time I watched this one. It's one of those movies that I've seen so many times.
It's always been there.
That it's sort of just one of those memories that I have, and I've read the story loads of times as well.
Oh yeah, of course. It's funny how some movies are just like, I don't know when I saw that movie. It's just been in my life for as long as I remember. It's just always been there.
Yeah. It's like Star Wars.
Yes.
I don't honestly remember the first time I saw any of the Star Wars.
Actually, the same.
The original 3 Star Wars movies.
Yeah.
Except for Jedi, I went to the
cinema.
Jedi,
yeah. So yeah, actually the same with me with Star Wars. This film, though, I know when I saw this was at my granddad's. This was part of his, I think I said before, it's part of his enormous black spine taped off TV collection that he so diligently cut adverts out of, and it was perfect. It was perfect. I don't know how he did it. But this was a favorite of his, and then became a favorite of mine, much like Them, as we've covered before. This was one of those, and I always loved this movie. I think it's a great adaptation of the novel. There are bits obviously different, but but I like it, and I like the touch of the name and things like that. And
I would have kind of liked to have seen so in the story he goes further. He basically goes to the death of the Earth.
Yes.
And I kind of would have liked to have seen that.
Yeah, I wonder whether how much of that is due to the film's budget, because I think it was only about $750,000. Like, it was a low budget movie.
It struggled with this one because no one wanted it. No one wanted to take it, and it was a British version of which bloody company is it? I forget which company it was now, but they couldn't, and they were so strapped for cash they couldn't even film it in Britain, so they actually hired the studio in California to do it.
Yeah.
It just, no one wanted to do it. No one wanted to touch it.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about such a now classic film that nobody wanted. But then, obviously famously, nobody wanted to make Lord of the Rings either. Until Jackson went to the right place. But yeah, it's interesting. But I think they did a remarkable job with the budget they had. To this day, The Time Machine is my favorite time machine of all time. I think it's the most beautiful thing ever. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful object.
It's incredible. I'm so glad they rescued it from the pawn shop or wherever the fuck they found it and rebuilt it.
Built it, yeah. And that was made by Bill Ferrari and Hua Cheng.
Yes.
Hua Cheng, who, if you didn't know, designed almost all of the cool props for Star Trek.
Yeah, he was like the lead on Wrath of Khan, right? I think.
Yes, I think he might have been the lead on Wrath of Khan. Was it Wrath of Khan? Or was it?
I could be wrong about that. I know he's very heavily associated with Star Trek.
Yeah, well, he made the communicator, and he made all the tricorder, stuff like that. So yeah, he was very influential, and then you can I think you can see
the DNA.
Yeah, this movie does feel very much like the original series. It's got that overall color palette.
Even the control panel. It's got the colors. It's very Technicolor. It's very Star Trek. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've always loved this movie. Let's get into it, shall we? So we open with that wonderful score, the kind of opening score.
it's got such a. There's the thing I love about that the score for this is there's such a tinge of sadness to it all.
Yes, there is. Yeah,
It has this wonderful sort of like just on the verge of almost like bringing you to tears all the time because it's just really sad. And
and it is quite a sad story, really.
Yes.
It's full of sadness, and yeah, the score definitely shows that. And then we go into the title sequence, which I have always thought, I don't know about you, but this must have heavily influenced Sam Raimi. This fucking the clocks and stuff. It's so Sam Raimi.
Yeah.
But yeah, you see all the timepieces kind of floating over black, and they're all kind of floating kind of jankily in that Raimi kind of style.
Yeah.
And then of course we get the title of H.G. Wells, The Time Machine. We open after the credits. We open with the four guys or the three guys who are meeting on New Year's Eve, and they're waiting for their friend George. Now, obviously, in the novel, he was just called the Time Traveler, I think, right? Or the Traveler. Here, he's called H. George Wells, which I thought, yeah, why not?
Yeah.
It's a nice nod. But they're all waiting for him, and I absolutely love the cantankerous old fat guy. He's like my favorite. Yeah. I love him so much. He's so good. He's just every Victorian asshole,
I love Alan Young's Philby.
Oh, Philby's amazing.
Philby is one of my favourite characters.
He's such their friendship is so believable in this and so lovely.
He's such a lovely guy.
Such a loyal friend.
And I love that when because he's like the last to arrive in the house, and he's sort of taking the maid's taking his coat and hat and stuff, and he looks and he just looks so out of place with the other guys.
He does,
because you can sort of, I think you can tell that he's clearly new money. Like, yes, he owns the shop, and he's obviously got money because he's with these guys. But he's obviously new money, whereas the other three are all like old money. You've got one who I think is I think it's Kemp is a banker. I think.
They're all extremely wealthy men.
Yeah, Halo's a doctor, and I think the other guy is I think he's just like a dilettante. The one who like hiccups when he's completely wasted.
Yes,
and has the sort of some of the funnier lines.
I love because they're sat in the room in the living room, and there's all these clocks.
Yeah, clocks and watches everywhere. And they go off and they annoy the big guy, and he's like getting all annoyed. Yeah. And I love the maid comes in to deliver the letter. That George is instructed to deliver, and he is so rude to her. Yep.
The look she gives him when she walks out of the room is hilarious. She just gives him such side eye when she walks out of the room. She's like, "You fucking asshole," because you can tell she loves Philby. She fucking loves Philby.
Oh yeah, because Philby's absolutely adorable.
Yeah,
and I love it. Was it the doctor says to the dilettante one? What time is it? And
I love that because the guy checks as well. He goes to check his stopwatch.
He's got his watch out, and he sort of like just goes, "Oh,
it's so good."
Look around, just like,
yeah, it was such a lovely little joke. But yeah, so they're all kind of angry. The maid comes in and she says, "Well, have you seen him? Has he been? Because Philby's like, oh, he's probably just been delayed." And she's like, well, he's in his laboratory all the time. He barely ever comes out. He picks at his food. Like, he's so rarely around. But in the end, they've kind of had enough, and he kind of grabs the letter himself, doesn't he? The big guy, and he kind of starts complaining. He's like, oh, he's making fools of us, and inviting us here and then not showing up, and they're also like, I guess they're not rude for the period, but it comes across really rude. It's like, are we here for food or not? Are we getting food? Because they all kind of head into the dining room, and then of course George bursts through the door, kind of exhausted and torn up. His shirt's all torn, and he's bloody and covered in soot, and kind of collapses into his chair. And of course George is the first to kind of help him. The rest just kind of stare at him like some kind of
food. I like the Oh, which one? It's the dilettante one. The Bridewell.
Yes.
He gives him his
his
drink.
wine and then drinks a load of himself.
And
Pours
then,
one for himself.
Then pours a new one for himself and like downs it.
Yeah. But yeah, so they're all like, what on earth has happened? It's like, they're like, well, can you speak? What's going on? And he kind of explains. He said, well, it's all right. Because I think Philby's like, well, don't pressure him if maybe he can't talk about it. And he's like, no, I need to talk about it while I remember it.
Yeah.
And so this whole film is effectively him recounting the tale to them at the table here.
Yeah.
So 5 days previous, because this is 1900, right? This is 1900. This is like 5 days into 1900 at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
So they go back. Then they go back to New Year. So it was 5 days ago was New Year, and it's New Year's Eve. George has invited everyone around to show off his new invention, and he says it's about time. And of course they all think it's a timepiece. They're like, oh, it's a new timepiece. And the big guy's like, oh, I've always said we need what we need is a new timepiece for the Navy. And
we needs a new timepiece and stuff like that. Yeah. And I love the when he's explained, he's talking about the dimensions and what you need for that. And I love the way that Hillier is like, well, everybody knows that. And
it's like, go on then.
Well, if you know it, then you explain it to us.
Yeah. And yeah, so of course he says, as you say, there are 3 dimensions. I'm referring to the 4th dimension, and of course, they're like, oh, the 4th dimension's nonsense. That doesn't exist. And I think Philby's the one that's the most honest, where he's like, can you remind me what the 3 dimensions are, isn't he? Yeah. He's like, can you just refresh me on it? Whereas the rest of them kind of pretend like they know, especially what's his name, the big guy. But yeah, so they explain the 3 dimensions, and then of course George says, well, this is the 4th dimension, talking about time, and it's not a timepiece. So he says, contrary to what you say, the 4th dimension is very real. The reason people don't talk about it is that we are prisoners to it. Unlike the 3 dimensions where we have choice, the 4th dimension we have no choice. We're stuck in time. We're linear in time until now, because he has invented a time machine, which of course is met with. I think they think it's a joke at first, right? They think it's like a practical joke.
And again, the doctor's like, you're wasting your time with all these inventions. It's like the war is happening, and the government could do with really good inventors.
With inventors, like, do you not think a time machine would be useful to the fucking military, dude? I mean, not that I would suggest that's a good idea, but I'm just saying.
I mean, their response is sort of, well, how can we monetize it?
They're all businessmen, though, aren't they? That's all they think about is money. But yeah, so of course he has this small box, and it's this lovely ornate display box.
It's utterly beautiful. Like, even just like, oh, this is just the model, and it's in that amazing box with
padded,
the velvet lining,
yeah.
And there's a completely and utterly amazingly detailed model, which is like, it didn't need to be like that at all. You didn't really need to make a complete replica of the full size one.
I wonder how much of it was just that George Powell wanted one.
Probably, yeah.
Apparently, unfortunately, got lost in a unfortunately, much like California is now right now, or LA is right now with the fire, with the fires. Yeah. It was one of those, unfortunately, I think. But yeah, it's a wonderful little model, and it's kind of ridiculous. Although, like, a lot of films from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s had this obsession with miniature things. You see it in like Bride of Frankenstein. We've got miniature people.
Thing, it's a very much thing to have a working model before you have the thing.
Yeah. This thing, of course, he's like, well, I need witnesses because I've only made this with a dial, and if I push it forward, I'm not there to push it back, so it'll just disappear into the future. And so he borrows a cigar, and he says, well, let's assume this cigar was the occupant of the time machine, and he puts it in the time machine, and of course he pushes the lever, and I think actually he does briefly explain how, you know, you push the dial forward, it goes forward, you push it backwards, it goes backwards, and you know, and then he pushes the lever, and you know, even the room starts shaking and everything. So something's clearly going on. It's not like because they pass it off as like a cheap parlor trick, don't they? They're like, oh, it's, you know, anyone could. It doesn't. I think even Philby says also anyone at the Hippodrome could have pulled that off. You know.
Yeah, even Philby says that you know, somebody can do that in a number of ways. You know. Yeah.
But yeah, his beautiful model is lost forever as it spins and spins and disappears into the future. They're all, you know, amazed by the thing disappearing. And of course the big guy is like, because I think he's a scientist, right?
No, he's a doctor.
Oh, he's a doctor. That's right. And he's just like, this is nonsense. And he's like, well, it's not here. Where's it gone? And he said, well, it's still, you know, George says it's still here in the conventional sense. It's not gone anywhere. And he's like, but why can't I touch it? And he's like, because it occupies a different time. And he's like, space is space. And it's like, no, space is different. Like 1,000,000 years ago, this could be under the water. And 1,000,000 years from now, it could be inside of a mountain. Foreshadowing. So, you know, it's he basically says, you know, like it occupies the same space but not the same time because the fourth dimension separates them. But they're pretty much not having any of it. He's just like, no, this is just total nonsense. And then of course, like you said, they get onto the subject of money. They're like, well, how would you market such a contraption, even if it were true? And he's like, well, I haven't really considered that. And they're like, oh god, like you're hopeless to us, you know. Like, to them, money is everything. If you're not monetizing it, why are you even bothering inventing in the first place? I think it's one of the other fellows says to him, like, if you use this thing, how do you plan to get back? What if you get trapped? And he's like, I'm willing to take that risk. And I think they try and talk him out of it, don't they? Because they try and talk him out of it to work for the military or something. I think they're like, oh, we can get the contract signed. You know, we can get you.
Yeah, I can get you. You can do something for the government. You can really do like wonderful things instead of what they see as a sort of boondoggle, isn't it? It's like something.
Yeah. But George realizes he's not really getting anywhere with these people. And then fortunately they realize it's almost New Year, so they decide they've all got better places to go in the next 2 seconds before New Year happens. Like, oh yes, we must be going because New Year is in 1 minute's time. I must get to this party. So they all leave, and I love the three of them leave, and George follows them, and he completely forgets about Philby. Philby just blends in.
Philby just
sits quietly because the rest of them are so loud, and Philby's quiet and just, you know.
And George is in his frustration. He's sort of like, you know, throwing things around the room, and he
starts writing the letter, doesn't he? And
he starts writing the letter, and he's sort of checking on the, you know, dates and things, and he's sort of angrily sort of, you know, walking around, and he's about to. Is he about to leave, or he's about to do something?
He's about to go to the time machine, I think, because he reads about the war in the newspaper as well, doesn't he? Which infuriates him. So he goes to start writing the letter, and I think he's talking about leaving. And it's at that point that Philby's like, George, I felt it best if I stayed. You know, because I think Philby is like, my friend has lost his mind. I need to be here for my friend and try and help him because he's clearly disturbed and there's clearly something wrong.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, you've been behaving like oddly for like a month now, you know. And he says he's not going to leave until he tells him what's going on, basically.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, you've changed enormously. And
George
George is
he says, you know, why don't you come home with me? Come home with me. Come and see the wife, and come and see little Jamie. You haven't, you haven't seen him for a thing, and you can see that
he smiles, doesn't he? He's like,
yeah,
genuinely.
He's sort of, for a moment, he sort of, like, he loves the idea. It's like, oh, you know, it would be a simple thing just to go and enjoy myself on this night, but he pulls himself back, doesn't he? You know, so he's not going.
Yeah, well, he vents his frustration about how he feels that he was born in the wrong time, and that these days people aren't dying fast enough anymore, and we're inventing new machines and new ways of killing people faster. And Philby's like, I agree, but we live in this time. Like, we just have to make the most of this time. But of course, you know, George is having none of that. And then Philby's like, well, where would you go? Rome? Would you be a Roman? A Greek? Yeah. Like, would you be a pharaoh? And he's like, actually, Philby, I'm thinking about the future. And I think Philby's genuinely concerned. He's like, well, I saw the bloody thing disappear.
Yeah.
You might just kill yourself. There's no guarantee it's going to go through time.
Mm-hmm.
And Philby does kind of say, well, maybe it was a trick. You know, a magician at the Hippodrome could have done something like this. I think George even offers for him to come with him, doesn't he? He's like, you can come with me. And he's like, no, I will have nothing to do with this. You know, I don't want to trifle with, you know.
Yeah, he's sort of in an almost sort of religious way. He's like, no.
Yes.
There are some things we shouldn't really be messing around with. And I don't want to, you know, get into that sort of level of delve into that sort of stuff. Really, it's not for me, and it shouldn't be for you either, sort of thing.
Yeah, and then George is like, he's very cold. He kind of snaps at him, and he's like, you know, I'm sure you've got New Year's plans. Don't let me stop you. You know.
Yeah.
So of course Philby goes to leave, and George does very quickly come up to him. He's like, well, I'm sorry. I you know, I'm sorry I snapped, and he's like, just promise me you won't leave the house tonight.
Yeah.
Which of course is famous last words.
Yeah.
Well, and I think George says, I promise I won't walk out the door.
Yeah. Like, that's exactly what he says. I promise I won't step outside the door.
So with that, you know, they shake hands, and Philby grabs his coat and leaves. And George immediately goes back to what he was doing. He starts writing the letter, which of course was delivered at the start of the film. And he writes on the 5th of January that they're having dinner, and he tells Mrs. Watch it.
Yeah.
I knew the name was in my brain somewhere. I was like, it's back there somewhere. He tells Mrs. Watchett that they're having people over for dinner, and he leaves the note on the mantelpiece to be opened, presumably by Mrs. Watchett, and delivered at the later date. And yeah, so he puts on his smoking jacket and enters his workshop, where we see the full size time machine for the first time. And it really is a thing of beauty, I think. That Victorian barber's chair and all the brass, and I love it. I love it so much.
I mean, it's a steampunk fan's wet dream.
It really is, yes. Yeah.
And I mean, I love it that it makes an appearance in Gremlins, and
it makes an appearance in loads of things, actually.
Yeah. I mean, even the Big Bang Theory, they buy it. They think they're buying a small replica, and they actually buy the whole, the whole thing, which is quite funny.
I think it was used for promotions for Back to the Future as well.
Say that again, sorry?
I think it was used in promotions for Back to the Future as well.
I think you're right. I
seem to remember Michael J. Fox sitting in it at some point and talking about time, and then they show off the DeLorean and like, look, it's cooler, it's a car.
Yeah, I think he was doing it. It's for a documentary for this film, I think, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, that would make sense.
Fox narrated.
I do like as well. So it's powered by this crystal controller.
Yeah.
And I like that he looks at it. He's like, oh, it's not quite right, and he goes to the grindstone and he grinds it a little bit first, just so he's perfectly happy with it. But yeah, so he's all set, and he sits in the chair, and there's that kind of reverence when he sits in it as well, where he's He has that moment to himself before he does anything.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he switches it all on. We see the dial, which I think is the only time you see his full name, isn't it? Because it's like created by
Got the
H. George Wells. Yeah. And so he pushes the lever slowly, and then we get his narration, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
He starts.
Yeah, and he's lit a candle, so you can see the sort of the candle on the table, and
oh yes, of course, yeah.
And he at first he thinks nothing has changed, but then he notices the candle's burned down, and the clock actually moved forward, unlike his own watch, which was obviously on him.
Yeah. And yeah, because of course it's been snowing as well, and there's still snow on the window panes and whatnot. So he thinks there's no change until he sees the candle. And then he decides to push forward. Like you said, he checks his fob watch and realizes, oh, time hasn't changed for me, but it has for everything outside of the time machine. I think in the remake they show it as like a time bubble, don't they? But obviously here we don't see there's a bubble around him.
Yeah, and the time machine in that is fucking beautiful as well.
It is. I think I have such a biased love for this film.
Yeah,
I don't hate that remake. I think it's quite good, but I just love this movie too much.
It's not a bad. It's not a bad.
It's
movie.
not bad, yeah.
But it's. I think it's helped by Guy Pearce's charm, to be honest, which is always nice. And I do love what they did with the museum. I like the
yes
the talking bass, which is great.
Yeah. So he presses forward further, and we see the sun going past the window. We see the snail, all of that painting and animation,
which we haven't had until this point. And he starts narrating what he's doing and how he's rolling.
Amazing.
The machine and how he's slowly figuring it out and getting used to how much pressure he needs to sort of
speed things or slow things down.
Yeah.
We get those wonderful animations of the plants and the snail. And then he sees Mrs. Watchett looking in the shop window, which is when he first notices the mannequin.
Yeah.
Across the street, which I think is a wonderful way to show the transition of time later.
Yeah.
I love that idea.
Yeah, I like
changing
the way
of fashion.
He's like almost shocked at the new dress and
yeah, because doesn't he say like I was curious to see how far women would permit this to continue?
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, we get that wonderful shot of the sun and going over. We see the snow start to disappear as he kind of pushes forward. So he starts pushing forward even further because he says it kind of became intoxicating to him. He just, he wanted to go further and faster and kind of see what the future held. So now he's not moving in days. Now he's moving in months and, then ultimately years. And like you said, he starts to learn how to handle it, where he can stop for a day or he can slow down and speed up. And yeah, he starts looking at the mannequin and he's like, oh, the fashion. In just a few years, the fashion has changed quite dramatically to him. Because of course we're talking Victorian sentiment and now you're seeing leg and you're seeing,
Yeah.
So yeah, he pushes on and we get that great the great time lapse of the different dresses and the different outfits as time's going on.
And then I love it. All of a sudden it goes dark. Everything the windows are boarded up. Everything's changed, and it's like, what the hell just happened then?
Yeah, because he gets that shake as well, doesn't he? Doesn't everything shake as well? And he's like, oh, what happened? Like the light's gone, and so he ends up stopping in 1917. And now, of course, the laboratory and the whole house is just covered in cobwebs. Everything's covered up and boarded up. Windows are boarded up, which is why
all the doors and windows are boarded up.
He's basically gone into a Hammer set all of a sudden.
Yeah,
it's like taking the time machine into Dracula. There's like heavy cobwebs everywhere. It looks amazing. Set dressing is top notch. And yeah, so he kind of like enters his room and starts looking at the clocks and seeing when the clock stopped and all the furniture's covered. And yeah, he decides, he's gonna go outside, and of course he opens up the front door and finds the boards in front of the door, and he's like, oh god, kind of breaks the boards, and exits the house. And I think the first thing he sees is a car, right? It's the car being driven by Jamie. Is it Jamie, his son?
Yeah.
And of course he thinks this is remarkable. Like, obviously he's never seen a car before. And this young soldier gets out. Of course he recognizes his Philby, played by the same actor, of course.
Yeah.
Alan
Young was great.
Yeah, fantastic.
He's three of my favourite voices from cartoons. He's Scrooge McDuck.
Yes.
Famously. And he was also Seven Zark Seven and
was he?
Keop. Yep, and Keop from Battle of the Planets.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I knew he was Scrooge. I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yeah. And, I mean, famously, he was also Wilbur in Mr. Ed.
Yes.
Which was kind of how he sort of, how most people sort of knew him from. Mm. And apparently he had a stake in Mr. Ed, so he became independently wealthy from Mr. Ed.
Oh, good. That's nice to know.
Yeah, it's kind of really cool. I like
that. So of course he's like, "Oh, Philby," and he's like, "I don't think I know you, sir." And he's like, "Well, what are you talking about?" And he says, "Oh, I think you're confusing me with my father." He says there was quite a resemblance. He says, "I'm James," and he's like, he was like, "Oh, did you know my father?" Or, yeah, I think it's something like, "Did you know my father?" And he's like, "No."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Oh yeah, he passed away last year, was it? In the war." Yeah, and
he says, I've been away for a while. I've not been around. I missed it. And he says, "Oh, have you been to the front?" And he's like, "Front of what?"
Yeah.
And Jamie then has to explain the war to him. It's like, where have you been? It's like,
yeah,
to miss the war. It's like,
there's a world war, and of course he talks about the guy across the street. He says, "Well, what about the man across the street?" And he's like, "Oh, you mean the inventor?" And he says, "Well, my father was made the treasurer of the estate, and he will not sell it." He said, "It's not for sale. You will never sell it." And basically, I guess he's made his son never sell it too. He's like, "You will never sell that house," and he says because he was convinced that the owner would come back someday. So he did believe him.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he basically says no, he's never gonna sell it. And so he says, "Who are you anyway?" He says, "Oh, just some stranger who knew your father." And then, as you said, they talk about the front, and he realizes he doesn't know anything about the war. He's like, "What war?" He's like, "Are you mad?" And he says, "Well, would you like to come in, perhaps like for a cup of tea? Maybe you need to kind of settle yourself." And you can tell a lot of the traits of his father are in him. He's kind and he's caring, just like his father was.
Yeah.
But he says, I'm quite all right, and take care, and I think as he heads off, he says, "Goodbye, Jamie," in a very knowing kind of way. It's interesting as well. It works quite well because in World War I, his fashion is old-fashioned, but you can kind of get away with it still.
Yeah,
it's not like ridiculously out of place.
No.
To where he'd be like, "What are you wearing? Are you in fancy dress?" Because he's wearing that smoking jacket, and it's not modern by those standards, but it's not terribly.
No, it kind of just basically looks like a dressing gown. It's just He looks like Arthur Dent, basically.
Yes, he kind of does, yeah. So he heads back to the house, kind of upset. He breaks the boards off the window, doesn't he, to the laboratory, so he can see again.
So that he can see the mannequin. But does he also see the plaque at this point as well? Or is the plaque after the house is
The
gone.
plaque is in the future because he's dedicated the garden, hasn't he?
That's right. Yes.
The future garden is dedicated.
Yeah.
Because at this point the gardens are shithole.
Yeah.
Because it's when the house gets destroyed, right?
That's right.
Which is when it's there. So he pushes forward again. He heads back to the time machine and pushes forward through the years. And I love when he's watching the fashion, and then he hears the explosions, and he's like, "Oh my god, the war's still going on." And then he says, like, I can't remember what he says, but he says to his horror, he realizes it's a new war. It's not the same war. Yeah. It's a different war.
He sees the sort of the airplane in the sky, and
you see the anti-air blimps as well, don't you? The whatever you call them. And he kind of realizes with his horror that, you know, last time he stopped it was 1917, and now it's like 47 or something, and it's a new war. This war he doesn't even stop for. He's like, fuck it, go forward. Let's get past this. There has to become a point where this is no longer, we're not at war, you know. So he pushes forward, and then suddenly the entire house explodes around him into flames, and it's gone. And now he's in the open air. So he's moving through time, and he sees the rebuilding of the street around him, which is lovely, like stop motion kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's one of the only times that the effects look slightly dodgy. It's when you see the house in the street. You know, there's the sort of the full sort of view of the house. You've got the house on the left, and then you've got the street.
Yeah.
The street doesn't quite match. It
yes.
looks just slightly janky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think overall the effects are great. I mean,
I think they look really, really good.
The car models and stuff like that are really cool.
Oh, yeah, wonderful. Because so then he stops in 66, which is the future.
Yeah.
Obviously 6 years into the future of this movie coming out. And then this is where he finds the plaque, doesn't he? Because he sees people running, and he hears the air raid siren, and he's like, he doesn't understand.
Why he stopped, wasn't it? Because he could hear the siren. The siren was what sort of made him stop.
Yeah. And he says at first he thinks initially that people are running because of him, because he's just appeared out of thin air.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it's an air raid, and of course as he leaves, he sees these people in the silver jumpsuits and the helmets saying, "Get to the shelter, get to the shelter." We see the building, Philby's.
Yep.
Is obviously some kind of
massive department store.
Massive department store. And he sees the plaque, as you said, the park, and it says it's like dedicated to his father's devotion to his friend George or something like that.
Yeah.
Because it's James obviously that dedicated it. And I like that it's a sundial. It might even be the sundial that was in his garden originally, but it's a nice idea, as he was an inventor of time machines, you know. I do love in the shop window we get the latest tubeless TV.
Yeah.
Which I thought, well, you know, that was one thing they got right. Yeah. There's a flat screen in the bloody window.
A bit early, but yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, this 66 is very different from actual 66.
Just a little.
You know, we haven't got Batman driving down the street. And of course, we see old Jamie, who you know is basically telling him to get the fuck into a shelter. He's like, "What are you doing, you madman?" Like. Because he says, doesn't he say, like, come on, the mushrooms will be sprouting, and he's like, what mushrooms? Yep. What are you talking about?
Mushrooms will be sprouting soon.
He says, come on.
You get that satellite thing going overhead, don't you? And he says, oh,
they're zeroing in the nuclear satellite. Yeah. Aren't they like targeting satellites or something? Isn't that the idea?
Yeah.
And he's like, what are you talking about? And he says, you know, he says, have we met before? And he says, yes, like I met you across the street, just over there, in fact, many years ago. And he says, oh, I'm sure we have, but the time escapes me. And he says it was 2 wars ago.
Yeah.
And he says, "Oh God, 1917. Now I recall. You inquired about my father and the house that used to stand there." And then he kind of realizes, he's like, "Hold on a minute, you look exactly the same.
Look any
like
different. Yeah.
he's like that's absolutely impossible. Like you haven't changed. Like how is any of this even possible?" And of course, at this point, he points out the clothes, which is good because someone had to.
Did
And
you
he
notice,
says,
by the way, that the uniforms that the wardens and that are wearing,
hmm.
they're the uniforms from Forbidden Planet.
I did, yeah. They are very similar. Are they actual uniforms? Are they?
They are the actual uniforms from Forbidden Planet.
Well, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. But yeah, of course, Philby's like, if no offense, past man, but I'm getting into the fucking shelter, so
Yeah.
goodbye. And of course he runs off.
Well, I'd say run.
Well, it runs for like a 90-year-old man.
He ambles off in an elderly fashion.
Yeah. Fair play to him though. He was still working.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's plenty of young people that could have probably done that job. They weren't doing anything. They were just running away. And then of course the bomb hits.
Yeah.
And strawberry jam goes fucking everywhere.
It's oatmeal.
Is it oatmeal?
Yeah.
I always thought, as a kid, I thought this scene was fucking amazing.
It's fucking cool.
I think it holds up really well. And as a kid, obviously, I thought this looked incredible. Like
Yeah.
I never even thought about special effects or anything at the time. I thought it was amazing.
No, as a kid, it's just fucking lava.
Yeah, it's lava.
And I like, because he says that you get the nuclear bombs. He says, and then the Earth's response to the bombs, and then you get all the lava come out. And it's like, oh, that was a really cool line. I like
It's a great line, and I also love the line when he says something like "the labor of centuries gone in an instant," something like that.
Yeah.
The nature's response is wonderful.
I love it again. You get as with many a movie that we've discussed before.
Yes.
About effects and things, and so they made this massive pile of porridge basically for this effect.
Yeah.
And then, like what they did with the meat in
they just left it. Oh.
They left it, yeah, and then came back to it.
Just leave it under those studio lights. It'll be fine.
Yeah, and apparently it was absolutely rancid.
Dude, 50s?
Absolutely disgusting.
Fucking 50s studio lights as well? That's proper hot. That's not like... Oof.
Yeah. It's like the meat in Videodrome with it.
Yeah.
Left it in a bag over the weekend. Like,
I mean, at least with this, they weren't so close. They're not interacting with it as much. Although I guess the animators probably had to do quite a bit with it, but yeah, I always thought these miniatures look great. I think the lava effect is fantastic, especially for the time. I still think it looks pretty good, to be honest. It's natural. It looks more natural than a lot of CG.
It's only the sort of when you see the sort of
it's the close-ups that I think
the street and the sort of the matte paintings that sort of don't quite match up properly.
Yeah.
But it's still great for bloody 1960.
Incredible, yeah, really incredible, and I still think it's a wonderful effect to this day. And so George runs to the time machine, and of course he moves forward just as the lava kind of reaches him, and he kind of clutches it himself as he is engulfed by rock, and suddenly he's now in a mountain. And I think with this movie you kind of have to assume that wherever the time machine is, there's just a bubble that's protecting the time machine, so nothing ever, because otherwise why is the rock not just fully, why is he not going to appear in rock,
I think that's they basically just made it an actual thing in the remake.
Which is I think a good call in the remake, that they're like, there's actually a bubble, so there's always going to be that protection. But
and I do love again with the effects wise when they came up with this idea for the mountain going over the thing, and the effects guys were like so relieved when they found out that they didn't have to sort of
no more animation for a bit.
Yeah, they didn't have to make different versions of the upcoming future,
Mm-hmm.
as much all the way up to when you eventually get to the next bit,
Yeah, well, I think that's the budget, isn't it? They were like, we'd love to, but we can't, so just chuck rocks in after 1966. we could probably get away with modern cars in 1966, just change it a little bit with the suits from Forbidden Planet and then move on.
Yeah.
But while he's protected, presumably, in the time machine, he does feel the effects of the cold.
Yeah.
And he says he starts to get cold, but he puts his faith in Mother Time, I think he says, or something like that. Father Time.
Yeah.
And he says that he prays, doesn't he, as well?
Yeah.
And that he just had to have faith in the process and wait for the rocks to wear down. So, of course, he does that. He pushes forward even faster.
Yeah, it's a long time before.
Well, he's waiting for a mountain to disappear, effectively.
Yeah,
that is a lot of erosion. That's a long old time. So yeah, he pushes forward until the rocks have disappeared, and then he's out in the open again. And this time he sees something great. He sees the world recover effectively. He sees greenery return, and he sees this wonderful city off in the background that looks really beautiful and picturesque, and
yeah,
it almost looks like, I guess to his eyes, like an idyllic future.
Yeah.
And so he stops, and it is a ludicrous number. It's like isn't it like 802,000 something?
Yeah,
it's like it's ludicrously in the future now. Like Earth is probably no longer here, future. Sun's gone away, future, but fine, whatever. And yeah, so he stops, but he stops too fast, which causes the time machine to spin around a bit and then fall over. He went too fast. He stopped too quickly. And there is that slightly dodgy shot when he falls on the ground, and then someone chucks like a bucket of water over him or something. The water just kind of falls out of nowhere. It's like, what was that all about?
It almost looks like somebody chucked a load of glitter on him or something. It's an odd thing.
I guess it was just to kind of symbolize it all went a bit wrong. But yeah, he's kind of thrown to the floor, and as he looks up, he sees this huge sphinx, future sphinx, alien head thing. And yeah, so he writes the time machine, and then he tries to open the sphinx, but he can't, and he kind of knocks on the door, but there's no answer. So he takes the time machine control, and he heads out into the wilderness, which he just marvels at. All of these beautiful new plants and new species of plants.
Yeah, and fruits and yeah.
Yeah, and the world's kind of full of abundance. And as he travels, he does eventually come across some this kind of empty building, but there's fruit on the table.
Just before he finds the building, I like that. There's a sort of moment of panic he gets.
Yes.
And he sort of, he starts running to just sort of with the hope of finding something, because it's like he almost feels lost, and he doesn't quite know how to process it all.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because the building's in ruins as well, isn't it? Like the top of the building, like the dome is smashed that he's going to and stuff. So I guess there's still the fear that everyone's dead.
I'll say here, Rod Taylor this is only like the fourth movie he was in.
I know.
He was in like TV and stuff.
Yeah.
He's a bloody great actor.
He is superb. I think this is my favorite role of his, actually. But he is wonderful in this film.
Yeah.
Really, really good.
Good. So good.
So he goes inside this kind of domed building, and he finds fruit in bowls and I don't know, titanium unbreakable plates on the table.
Fully laden tables with food and drink
and like the strongest plates in the world, because he starts smashing this fucking plate on the table, and it's like, wow, I am amazed that plate is still in one piece. But But yeah, so he's calling out to people and he tries to make noise, but no one's there. But obviously the food's set out, so there must be people here somewhere. So he leaves, and eventually he hears kind of laughter and people kind of playing. And so he comes across the people there, who he kind of watches for a bit, and he's like, well, is this man's future just to bask in the sunlight and live off the abundance of fruit and stuff? And he's like, after all of this hardship, why not?
Yeah.
Initially, he loves this idea.
Yeah. At first, he's sort of really overjoyed at this idea that it's almost like a utopian existence. They've clearly, abandoned all sort of war and all that sort of thing, and they all seem happy and at peace, as it were.
It's a bit Aryan, but aside from that, it's all right. That is, of course, until we're introduced to Weena, who is drowning. And everyone's just kind of looking at her, and there's two fuckers that just right next to her as she's clinging to these rocks.
In the middle of the river, just sort of watching her drown.
Yeah. And of course, George is having none of that. And he's like, well, none of you help. And he throws his smoking jacket down and swims out to her. And pulls her out of the water and gives her his coat. He is obviously shocked by everyone's inaction and the lack of care. Like, no one even pays attention. The two guys kind of look, but they're just kind of more out of like, oh, what is she doing?
It's sort of, well, that just happened.
Yes.
It's sort of,
there's no shock or surprise or concern at all.
It's
a thing that's happened. Yeah.
It bears no consequence to them, and there are no consequences at all to anything else. So why does it matter?
But of course, I think he's then even more shocked when Weena gets up and just walks off.
Mm-hmm.
She just gets up and walks off like nothing's happened. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
So they're all totally confused.
And he realizes that, oh my God, that they have complete apathy. They have no sort of passion. They have no
nothing. There's no drive. There's no anything.
Yeah. And Yvette, I think you pronounce it Mimu, is Weena. My God, is she ethereal?
Oh God, she is gorgeous.
I think she was 17 when they started.
Really? Wow. She looks older than 17. 18. That's interesting. She does look older.
She turned 18 while they were filming.
See, I would have put her in like early 20s, but yeah, that is young. Yeah,
well, apparently, so she wasn't the initial choice. Taylor didn't want her as the choice at first, but they made their choice, and apparently when she started, she was very sort of wooden and stuff because she'd not acted before.
The thing is, it kind of works for the role, though.
It does, but the wonderful thing is that apparently as they went on filming, she just kept getting better and better.
Oh wow!
And so much so that they agreed to refilm her earlier scenes.
Oh wow, that's amazing.
With her new sort of, her new
skills, yeah.
And it's like, wow, you never hear them,
especially on the budget they had.
Yeah,
that's massive. Because film cost a lot back then, and this was, this movie was very low budget for the time. So or certainly low budget for what they were trying to do. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But he kind of, everyone runs into the dome building for food. And he kind of sits just despondently on the steps until Weena comes out and joins him. And she questions. She's like, why did you? And he's like, why did I save your life? And he said, well, why did I rescue you? He said, I did it to save your life. That doesn't seem to matter much to people around here. And she says, it doesn't matter. And he said, your friends were like watching you drown. No one lifted a finger to save you. Like, why? Well, it's a very curious way to treat a friend. And he's like, aren't you the least bit interested, like where I come from, or because obviously he's wearing odd clothes. He's like totally dressed weird for the time. His hair is weird
They're
for
all
the
just
time.
in these smocks, aren't they? They're just in
Yeah.
these sort of all pastel sort of coloured smocks.
Mm.
Which, if you notice, Weena is wearing the most vibrant one. She's the only one that has a bright pink.
Yes.
smock.
Yeah, the rest of them are kind of pastel, kind of. And yeah, not very colourful at all, actually. It's more like beiges, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's like sort of very dull blues and greens and yellows and things.
Yeah. And he says, "Oh, do you have any writing? Do you write? Like, I want to learn more about your culture to tell my time." And he shows her how to spell her name, Weena, and the Eloi, which are the name of the humans in the Eloi. Sorry, Eloi. That's right. And which always bugged me as a kid, because I was like, I would have spelled that with a Y, and he spells it with an I, and it always weirded me out. I was always like, it feels wrong. But
the English language.
Yes, yeah. But she takes him in for dinner, and everyone's there eating the biggest cherries and fruit in the world. And of course, George is trying to make conversation with them.
Yeah, they're not having any of it.
No, they don't give a shit. He's like, oh my god, in my time, people would like go crazy for a cherry like this. It would be like a award-winning berry. And yeah, they just don't care. I think one of them's like, you ask many questions. Like,
yeah, it's like, it's really tedious. Why are you asking these questions? It's like, we don't care.
He says, well, in the future, this is very strange. Perhaps even curiosity has died. But in my time, people would love to hear about this. I want to take this knowledge back and discuss with people in my time what the future's like. People are going to ask me questions. People are curious. And he says, what kind of government rules your world? And one of the kids is like, we have no government. And he's like, well, you must have like a ruling body that enforces laws and pass laws. And he's like, laws? We don't have any laws.
Yep.
And he's like, well, do you have like an economy? Like, how does anything, do you spend all of your time studying? Is that what it is? Like, you don't have to do anything anymore. You just spend all your time studying. And they're like, no, we just don't do anything, really.
He basically asks to see an old elder, doesn't he? He says, well, what about an elder? I need to speak to an elder that knows what's going on.
Yeah, and they says there's nobody older. I think Weena says that earlier, doesn't she? Yeah. She's like, there is nobody older. And he's like, what do you mean there's nobody older? It doesn't make any sense. So then, of course, he says, have you got any books? And he's like, yeah, we've got books. And they're like, oh my God, that's perfect. I can learn everything I need to know from books. Can you show me the books? And this kid's like, clearly like, if it shuts you up, take you to see some fucking books. I'm really hungry, to be honest. But... So, of course, he takes him to see these ruined old books. And I love it. He picks up a book and looks at the first page, and it crumbles in his hand. And he looks back at the kid and he's like, yes, this does tell me everything I need to know about your culture. Like, this does tell me everything. And I love the effect when the entire book just disintegrates in his hand.
Yeah.
Always thought that was a really cool
and when
effect.
he runs it, he like waves his hand across the others and they just disintegrate.
Completely disintegrate. I always thought that was a really cool effect. I'm not quite sure what they did to do that, but very cool. I'm assuming it was like some kind of weird wood or something, but
yeah,
because he's got structure until he touches it, and then it just
I'm guessing like formed dust or something.
Yeah, it's really cool because they look convincingly like books. And he gets angry and he's like, oh, bloody, a million years of people dying and striving for their dreams, and then all you do is dance and swim and play, and now he's quite bitter and angry about it all. It's all come to nothing. And he goes out and just basically has a go at all of these kids. He's like, bunch of assholes. Like, the future sucks. I'm going back to my time. Fuck this. And he storms out. Weena obviously follows him, or at least follows him to the door. Right? I don't think she goes all the way, but she kind of She thinks about following him.
Yeah.
And so he heads back towards his time machine. Only to find it's gone. It has been dragged inside, as we can see from the sled marks. Which is another thing we didn't mention, is that the George Pal apparently loved sledding as a kid.
Yeah, he based it on.
Which is why he wanted a sled to slide through time.
If I remember rightly, the time machine in the book is roughly described as almost like a bicycle.
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of different designs if you look at, different book covers and stuff through the years. Because I think it's one of those stories that was, like most of Wells's books, they were published in fucking everything, magazines and all sorts of stuff. But yes, I think you're right. I think it is more like a bike kind of thing. It does mention brass and ivory and stuff in the book, though, doesn't it? So he did add all of the brass and stuff in there. But so it's been dragged behind the door, which of course he can't open. But then he hears something from behind him, and he hears something in the undergrowth. He doesn't know what it is, and of course he sees for the first time a Morlock.
Yeah, you only really see its limbs, don't you? You don't sort of.
Yeah, well, he lights a match, doesn't he, to see them closer, and that scares them off. So yeah, you don't see much more. But then he hears something else, and of course it's Weena. She's come to find him. And he says, I need to get behind that door. And she's like, you can't get behind that door. Nobody opens that door apart from the Morlocks. And he's like, Morlocks? He's like, Morlocks? And she says, well, we must obey the Morlocks. We must obey their commands. And he says, why have they taken my machine? She says, you've got to tell me. And she says, look, it's night. We shouldn't be out at dark.
Because they mostly come at night.
They mostly come at night. And he says, look, I'll light a fire. These things seem to be scared of fire. We can wait it out. It'll be fine. And he says, look, help me gather some wood, and we'll spend the night here with fire, because they seem to be scared of fire anyway. And he's really curious, because he's like, you came for me. You didn't have to do that. Why did you do that? And I guess he's thinking like, hey, actually, maybe it is still there in humanity. It's buried, but it's still there, because she obviously cared enough to come and find me.
Yeah, there's a spark of curiosity. It still exists, perhaps, sort of thing.
Yeah. And so he says, hey, while they're gathering the wood, he's like, oh, my laboratory used to be there. My house used to be there, and that was my library over there. And he starts talking about the time machine, talking with his friends, and you can see he starts to miss his friends at that point. He's like, oh, actually, Philby might have been right, Like,
yeah.
Oops. Because now he's lost his time machine, as he said that might happen, and now he's, and he says, I hope to learn so much, and, such a great deal. And, he was going to take back knowledge and advancement, and, the sports almanac, he was going to gamble and shit. But
he'd hoped to see a world that had gone beyond war and things, and so he has, but it's just not what he expected.
Just not what he expected, yeah. But in that moment, of course, a Morlock grabs Mina and Weena. I keep calling her Mina, so annoying. It's because I was watching Nosferatu, and it made me think of Dracula.
It's such a horrible name.
Weena. He says it's a beautiful name. I'm like, I don't think it is.
No, it is. It sounds like a hot dog.
Yes, yes, it doesn't. It's not a good name. But anyway, he scares off the Morlock and sets the fire, which obviously keeps them at bay. But yeah, I think is it the first time she's seen a Morlock as well? I think she says I've never seen one.
Yeah, because you get the impression that none of them actually seen the Morlocks really.
No, but they're controlled by because they still believe in, they don't know what it is, but they react to the air raid siren as if it's a bomb, and they do the all clear and stuff, don't they? They're like, it's
been drummed into them. It's kind of what they did before, and it's slowly become a mesmerizing thing,
ingrained thing that they must
to the sirens.
Yeah, and he apologizes to Weena He says, like, I'm sorry I snapped earlier and called you all a bunch of assholes. You know, he was like, I had no right. I think he says, like, I had, it would be the same as if I visited Bali in my time and just started having a go at native people. And, you know, you know, he basically says, you know, I had no right and I'm sorry. And he says, you know, but you were safe and you came to get me though, you know, maybe there is some self-sacrifice and some Victorian spirit in you, you know, and maybe it just needs awakening.
To touch the fire, doesn't she? She's never seen fire before.
Yeah. She's no idea. Well, of course, because the Morlocks are scared of fire, so they would never allow them to have that knowledge. But yeah, and you know, he starts talking about, you know, the nature of man, and that all it needs is for someone to show them the way, and that hopefully they'll then, you know, find some of that human spirit again, and
yeah,
you know,
maybe bring civilization to them, as it were.
Yes, yeah.
And is it who she talks about the rings?
Yeah, he says, like, oh, you know, have you? Oh no, it's the next morning, isn't it? Because the next morning he looks down the big holes, doesn't he?
Ah, yeah.
And he's like, "Oh, can you hear that down there?" And she's like, "Oh, it's Morlocks. We mustn't go down there. It's you know, it's the Morlocks." And he's like, "Well, I need answers." And he's like, he's like, "Are there machines down there?" And she's like, "Oh, she said, "Oh, they're Morlocks, and there's machines down there." And she's like, "Have you ever seen these machines?" She's like, "Oh no, I've only ever heard of them." And he's like, "Well, who told you?" And she's like, "Oh, the rings." And he's like, "What kinds of rings?" She's like, "Rings that talk." And he's like, show me these talking rings." And there is a moment, if you're watching this for the first time, where you think, "Oh my god, this film was so ahead of its time. They invented CDs," because there's that bit when he looks at it and you're like, "Oh, it's a CD." Yeah. It's not a CD. It's a spinny ring. And so the idea is you spin the ring, and then it keeps spinning, and there's dialogue or presumably music or whatever stored on the rings as you spin them. There's lots of shots now of rings that are clearly coming to the end of their spin.
Yeah.
But they just kind of keep going magically. But it talks of like
it's clear this place is clearly a museum. It's
yes.
It's got...
Well, I think this is what they do in the other Time Machine, isn't it? In the remake, but a little bit probably better.
Yeah, it's because in the book it's a museum. It's that he goes to, and they don't have the rings, but he finds information that he needs.
Yeah.
And you can see, you know, the collections of things in the background. Like...
Yeah, they kind of allude to it here. You can see there's some stuff, but But yeah, and I think the first ring he plays is like, the war is in its like 300th year or something, and it's sort of like everything's fucked. But he's like, the war has finally come to an end, and
running out of provisions and.
Yeah, but he says, like, the war has finally come to an end, and there's that smile on his face briefly until he's like, because everyone's fucking dead, and there's, like, unbreathable atmosphere. And, yeah. These deadly germs, and everything's screwed. Mina, meanwhile, is just kind of smiling, because she doesn't really understand any of it. She's just like, this is great, look, it talks. It says stuff. But yeah, and obviously it sounds like the war was ended only because the world was too polluted and everything was screwed. The second ring is someone who's like, oh, you know, my name is not important. What is important is that I'm the last person who remembers how each of us made their own decisions, and you know, he's basically, I guess he was like the last of the humans before the split.
Yeah, because you know.
He talks about how some of them have gone underground and some of them haven't.
Yeah. Because it's you know, they're no longer really humans.
They've become a different race. Yeah.
Yeah, the Eloy are I think in the book they're quite small. They're almost sort of like children.
Yeah. Which I guess they've given them childlike qualities here. Apparently they even cast a child, which I was not aware of. But yeah, so you know, they've given them childlike qualities, but yeah, I think they're more like hobbity, aren't they? In the book.
That's kind of sort of the impression you get. Sort of a more sort of like a I guess like almost like a proto-human. That
Yeah.
they're sort of.
And of course, this is how he realizes there are no older people, because he's like, basically that whole generation's died out, and now it's just the kids that are left, which is why they're so hopeless and they don't really know anything.
Well, there's another reason.
Well, yes, we will very soon find out why. So he decides he's going to climb down one of the holes. She's like, "Ah, don't go, you won't come back." And he's like, "Oh, no, I'll be back." And of course, she gives him a gift. She gives him the flower, which he puts in his pocket. This is important for later. And then the siren happens, and so she, almost like she's programmed, stops doing everything she's doing and starts walking away. And of course, George is like, what the hell? So he kind of climbs out, and he's like, what's going on? And he climbs after her, because obviously she looks like she's just in a trance, and she just starts walking away. And then he sees that everyone's walking. They're all heading out to the Sphinx. And he can see as he approaches that the doors open, and some of the Eloi are heading in. Of course, he doesn't even know what an air raid bloody siren is. He's just totally, even no one knows what a fucking air raid siren is at this point in time. Not George, not anyone. But of course, the door closes before he can get in there, and the air raid siren stops. And George is like, what are you doing? Like, they've just taken half of your population. Like, what? Why aren't you helping them? What's wrong with you? And there's nothing wrong. It's all clear. It's like, what do you mean all clear? And they're like, it's all clear. It's fine. And of course then he thinks back to the two world wars, and he's like, oh, people calling out all clear back in the war, and he's like, there is no war. The war is over. It's gone. There's no more flying machines. There's no more bombs or wars. But of course, the Eloi have learned the wrong lesson from the rings. The rings have told them about the war, so they think there is a war.
Yeah.
Basically. He says, look, those bombs are dead. The men who made them are dead. There's nothing to fear. And then the kid's like, no, there is nothing to fear, because it's all clear.
It's all clear. It's fine now.
And he's like, well, when are they coming back? And the kid's like, they're never coming back. Nobody comes back. And he's like, well, wouldn't you even try to get them back? When you even try to help them? And of course, they all just leave. They just start walking away.
Yeah.
And he says, well, I'm going to try. He's like, God damn it, I'm going to go down there. So he heads back to the hole. And he starts climbing down, which is quite brave of him, because earlier in the film, we did see fire spurting out of these holes. But yeah, some of the kids are curious, and they do follow him, don't they? After he's kind of gone down, you can see.
Yeah, you do get a couple that sort of.
They're like, what is he doing?
Sort of curiosity about it.
I guess it's in the same way that they were curious about Wiener drowning. They're like, this guy's going to kill himself. Let's watch.
Yeah.
But yeah, George lowers himself down into the tomb, I guess, of the Morlocks.
I mean, I'm guessing they're vent holes, aren't they?
Yes, it's vent holes for their machines. I
guess.
And he finds a stick down there and makes a torch out of some moss or whatever that's growing on the wall. And yeah, he heads down and finds this huge map painting. But he finds a cave, and it's got machinery in it, and it obviously does something. So yeah, he looks down, and all he can see is dead fucking Eloi, just skeletons everywhere.
I mean,
they've been clearly eaten. They've been cannibalized.
They're really good at picking bones. I'll give them that.
Oh yeah,
those are some really well picked corpses.
Yeah. So yeah, effectively, it's one big factory for people.
Yeah. And it's the he realizes that the Morlocks eat the Eloi, and the Morlocks' main sort of production is to just keep the Eloi in food and and clothing, and they're
Keep them fat.
they're just there to be cattle for them.
Yeah, exactly that. They're just there to be fattened up and kept alive.
Yeah.
I do love when he's looking around. You get those Morlocks peeking through, and then he turns around and they're not there, and
Yeah.
it's good stuff. And
And again, I love the designs of the Morlocks.
I think they're really creepy with the red eyes and stuff.
Yeah,
I think it's
the glowing eyes are really cool. And I think, if I remember rightly, almost all of the actors playing the Morlocks were all wrestlers.
Oh, really? That makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he kind of, he starts looking around, and eventually he sees the newly inducted kids, including Weena, and they're all heading. They're all just following their programming, I guess. And George tries to save Weena, but is quickly whipped around the neck by a Morlock, and here we have our first kind of fight. George manages to get the whip, and he starts whipping back at the Morlocks and fighting them off.
Yeah, all you need is the Star Trek music, really, isn't it?
Oh God, it's so Star Trek. Yeah, it really is. It could so easily be Kirk.
Yeah.
But yeah, so unfortunately he's kind of ultimately overwhelmed, and they kind of corner him with the rest of the Eloi, and he's kind of pushed back. But the Morlocks are clearly kind of like, what just happened? Like, why did that one fight back? That doesn't normally happen.
That's never happened before.
But of course he remembers matches, and so he lights a match and blinds them. And we kind of see their vision, don't we? Where it's like,
yeah, that's a really cool effect. It's a very simple sort of light effect for them. The way they see the brightness of the match. It's a really cool effect.
Yeah, it's almost weird. It's almost a shame in a way. I guess it's 1960s lighting, isn't it? It would be far more effective if the caves weren't lit so brightly in the first place.
Yeah, it would have been better if
I understand the intent, and the intent is great, but because it's got that studio lighting, that even 60s lighting of like everything's lit perfectly, it's kind of harder to understand why they're so shocked by a match. But yeah, the intent is superb, and that vision thing is great. So yeah, of course they're all kind of terrified of the fire. It hurts them, and they kind of move away long enough for George to light the torch that he made. And now he's going to try and rescue the Eloi people. And yeah, the Morlocks are kind of almost powerless until one of them whips it out of his hand. And then it turns into a proper Star Trek brawl.
Yeah.
George is just going ham, and there are very, what I would call, I guess it's just 1960s fighting, very Kirk maneuvers.
Mm-hmm.
You get the double-handed,
tumbling hand, double hand punches,
double hand punches, swinging around the metal apparatus down there, climbing up on the rocks, and it's all like a jungle gym kind of stuff. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, you even get that. I love that. There's one particular bit where you've got sort of George stood there facing one Morlock, and you've got the other one that comes up behind him, and I love that you've got the rock is almost like a set of steps, because he just uses this. You see him bang.
Yes, like launch off the steps.
Launch onto him, which is really cool.
Yeah, I love when he's fighting the Morlocks as well. You start seeing all the Morlock paint rubbing off, and like you see fingerprints on the Morlocks, where it's like, oh, it's great. But Weena's the one that comes to the rescue as he's fighting them all off. Weena's the one that notices the torch, and she goes to grab the torch. She shows that she's smart enough to know that, but obviously a Morlock grabs her before she can actually act. But yeah, so it's just a big old fight and a big old pile on until
it's that some of the other Eloi are slowly.
It's one of the kids, isn't it? He makes the fist, and he's like, I can punch, and it's the kid, I think. Well, it's a combination. So the kid hits him on the back of the head, and then George kicks him into a rock.
Yeah, one of the Morlocks is basically got.
He's got George
the throw. He's he's almost completely overpowered him.
The Eloy kid hits him in the back of the head, and then George kicks him into a rock, and it's bloody gory. There's like blood comes out of his mouth and all sorts of shit.
I'd forgotten how.
Yeah, he really fucks him up.
Gets that big drip of blood out of his mouth.
Yeah,
yeah. Pretty gory for
60. Yeah, it's pretty explicit. I mean, they're monsters, I suppose, which is how they got away with it. But they're quite humanoid monsters.
Yeah.
I think they look great with the teeth and shit.
Mm-hmm.
They look really, they're really gross.
Yeah, they've got that sort of almost like the sort of a Chinese sort of Japanese that sort of
the traditional kind of
sort of Oni. They've almost got like an almost Oni look with the way their teeth come out of their mouths.
Yeah, they do actually. So George, I guess it's like gasoline or something they're powering everything on, because George lights something and it just blows the whole fucking place on fire. Everything bursts into flames.
Yeah, I presume it's sort of oil or like you said, petrol or something.
Something, because of course the Morlocks hate fire, so and light, so they're never using that stuff. They haven't thought about the safety of what if someone comes down here with a packet of matches.
It's pumping up. You see that it's going through the thing, so it must be part of the machines.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing by this point, the Morlocks don't really know how these.
No, it's probably just been passed down for them as well.
Just
like,
maintaining it, aren't they? Really,
Mm-hmm.
they probably don't know what they really do.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter anymore because George has destroyed their entire civilization with one errant throw of a torch. He's blown everything up, and the Eloy kids all escape.
I find it funny that he immediately goes, "Well, that's the end of them then."
Yeah, that's it. It's like when the second Doctor with the Daleks is like, "It's the final end. They will never be back again."
And you think, hang on a minute, you don't know how deep these bloody cave systems
and also
are.
they could be all over the planet. I mean, that might not be the end of all of them ever. Like. But he's like, no, it'll be fine. Just throw some sticks down there to keep the fire going, and they'll be dead forever.
Yeah, that'll be it.
That'll be the end of it.
Speaking of Doctor Who, the whole of the Skaro scenes.
Oh yeah,
a very very time machine. The whole,
especially Cushing's.
That's the Cushing one is completely influenced by this,
I think so too. Yeah, for sure. I also thought this probably influenced Fallout quite a bit as well, especially that 1960s future bit.
Yeah,
with the nukes and stuff.
I think so too.
Very Fallout. But yeah, so they're gone forever. We'll never see Morlocks ever again. And so George is now stuck in the future. The time machine's gone. He's there with Weena. He's looking at the flower, and she says, "Are you sorry?" And he's like, "Sorry for what?" And she's like, "That you have to stay." And he's like, "Well, yeah." Basically, he's like, "Yeah, kind of sucks."
Yeah.
He's like, "Well, I wish I could have gone back and told people of my time and about what the future has in store for them. The sorrow and the happiness, and what would they say?" Maybe I could have avoided some of it, but maybe not. And they have this kind of lovely conversation, and she says, "Is there someone in the past like me?" And he's like, "Well, no one like you." And he's like, "Oh, I've got friends, of course, friends that'll miss me." And she's like, "Any women?" And he's like, "Well, one." And she kind of looks hurt, and then he's like, "Ah, but it's Mrs. fucking what's her name?"
Mrs. Watch It.
Really she's like 62 years old, and yeah. Which is weird because she probably doesn't even know what a 62-year-old looks like. They're all kids.
True, yeah, like old and wrinkly. What the hell is that?
He must look ancient to them.
Yeah.
But yeah, and she's like, "Oh, what? How do the girls wear their hair in your time?" And he's like, "Up." And she's like, "What do you mean up?" And he's like, "Well, up. I don't know."
Probably understand women's hair.
Yeah, and she's like, "Show me." And he's like, "Well, all right, I guess I'll try." And she asks, like, she's like, "Would I be pretty?" And he's like, "Oh yes, you would be very pretty." And yeah, they go to kiss, but then the Eloy kids turn up and they're like, "Don't kiss that underage girl. The time machine's back."
Well, she's probably 18 by now.
She probably is. Yeah, I didn't even know she was underage when they started.
Well, technically, if she was English, it's.
Oh wait, yes, I suppose if she's English, it's bored. It's still fucking dodgy, but yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, the time machine's back, and so they go back and they see the door's now open and the time machine's magically back there for some reason. It wasn't there just now, but now it is. They've moved it back there, and of course he's like, come with me, Weena. You can join me in the past. But then the door closes and he's trapped behind the door. And Weena's kind of, upset. She's banging on the door. She can't stand the fact that she can't get to him, but there's no way of opening the door. It cannot be opened. But George is, of course, thinking, well, I can go back in time, or forward in time. But then, of course, the Morlocks, they weren't dead, Matt.
Yeah.
They were still alive, and now they're here to beat up George. So George murders a load more of them. He kicks one of them into a wall, or knocks him out at least. Maybe doesn't kill him, but knocks. Well, no, he does kill him because he turns into a skeleton. He definitely kills that guy.
Yeah.
And he heads forward into the future for a bit, and we get that amazing Morlock disintegration, which I think was wax and stuff.
Gory. I mean, its eye falls out and everything.
Yeah, it's really gory for the time. I think they used wax and did the old Indiana Jones melt thing, which is awesome. I bet they were proper worried about doing that. That's not an effect shot you're going to do twice.
No.
Don't want to bugger this up. But of course he realizes he's going in the wrong direction. And of course, as you said in the Wells novella, he does go further into the future, but here he goes back.
He in the book he goes forward and then he excuse me. There's like the world is just basically like
he goes to the end of the world, right?
Well, first of all, he ends up in this place where it's just like everything is like a mossy lichen sort of garden.
Yeah.
And there only appears to be, I think it's like giant crabs and butterflies wandering around. And then he goes even further, and it's basically the sun goes out. And
God, imagine all of that with like Harryhausen doing the giant crab and stuff. Oh,
yeah, that would have been really cool.
It was so cool.
But yeah. So in this one, he just turns back instead.
Yeah, he heads back, and of course he comes back on the day that he said he would be back. At the time he said he would be back. I noticed as well that the dial doesn't have time; it only has day.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess he just has to kind of guess without a clock in front of him when he's arriving. Luckily, this entire film only happens within a couple of meters, so the time machine's just in the garden. It's not like been dragged out into the street or down the road or anywhere like that. It's right next door.
Yeah.
So of course he's out in the garden, and he can hear the clock chiming. He smashes the window to break back into the house, and then of course he joins his friends, as we saw at the start of the film. He comes bursting through the door, and so he's told them the whole story. Now I'm assuming he didn't tell. Well, in fact, I know he doesn't, because there was a something of a sequel scene filmed where he tells George he dies in the war. So presumably didn't share all of the bits of story that he was telling in this recap.
Yeah.
He isn't like, oh, hey, George, you died in a war. I guess he kept that bit to himself. But
David, not George.
Sorry, David, yeah. But yeah, so yeah, he's like, wow, that was quite a bloody tale. That was a good yarn. And he's like, he's like, well, they say, oh yeah, you truly are an inventor, George. And he's like, oh yeah, I understand. He says, like, I understand you doubt me, and take it as a lie if you wish.
Yeah.
And he says, like, I scarcely believe it myself now that I'm back. He's like, yeah. But then he remembers, he finds the flower, and he's like, oh, the flower. And of course he gives it to David, and he's like, yeah, take that to your friends and see if you can identify that. And he says, I don't think I can.
Yeah,
identify.
He says you're an amateur botanist, Phil. But you see what you can make of that. And he's like, no, I don't recognise it at all.
Yeah. But of course, the big guy's not having any of that, and he's like, "Right, okay, I'm leaving before you prove me wrong. I'm just gonna walk out."
Yeah.
The doctor guy's like, "Yeah, you actually do look really exhausted. Though you should probably get some rest, my friend." But yeah, and of course, you know, Philby.
The drunken one. He says they're talking about you know, because they don't sort of believe his story.
No.
And I think that the doctor says something along the lines of well, where have you been for a week, sort of thing. And the dilettante one goes, well, you know, it's quite easy to lose a week.
yeah.
And he's even got a drunk hick as he leaves the house, which is hilarious.
I love when Philby says to George, he's like, "Oh, it's grand having you back," and then George says, "Goodbye, David," and he can tell straight away, like the smile drops off his face, and he realizes, like, huh, and he kind of wanders off, but you can tell he knows. He's like, oh. He's gonna leave, and then of course he follows up as he walks away. You get that great shot as he kind of stops in shot. You got George in the background, and George is like, "Thanks for being such a good friend all these years." And you know, David's clearly really concerned for his friend, but also feels like, you know, now he's seen the flower as well. He's like, oh, maybe he is actually gonna disappear. And he says, you know, they get to the car, and he's like, well, what do you think, Philby? And he's like, well, you know, you don't really believe this story, do you? And he doesn't kind of deny it. He's like, well, good night, and just kind of walks away. He's like, I'm not gonna say that I don't believe it, because obviously now he's starting to believe it. And of course he heads back to the house, and he hears the whirring of the machine. So he heads to the laboratory, opens the door, and all we see is the shape of the time machine in the dust, but we also see the track marks that have come from the garden and then somehow carved into the stone of the laboratory. It must have been a bloody heavy machine to cause the damage it's done. But he says, I think I understand, because the maid, who I keep forgetting the name of, Mrs. Watchett, she comes in, and he's like, I think I understand. The Sphinx was right over there, and Weena was stood here, and he couldn't get back, so he's dragged it back to here so that he can be with her again. And you know, he says it's the same space but in a different time, so he kind of understands, and he says he's going to help the Eloi build a new world and a better world for himself too, you know.
Yeah, and he says, you know, I'm sure he would have taken something with him.
I love this bit.
And she says that there's nothing I can see except for 3 books that are missing from the shelf, and he's like, what books? And she says, I have no idea, sort of thing.
Yeah, she says, does it matter? And he says, not really, but what 3 books would you have taken? Yeah, which I think is a lovely question. It's like, what 3 books would you take? It's a great
little question. I like that. It's a really cool thing. You know, what would you take to build a civilization with?
Yeah. The Declaration of Independence, isn't that what Kirk always does? Like, read the fucking Declaration of Independence, you assholes.
Yeah.
It's the American way. But yeah, so he heads off, and he, you know, as he leaves, he says, we'll see him again soon. He has all the time in the world.
Yeah.
And off he goes, and that was it. The end. The end of the time machine. There is the additional scene that they did along with that documentary.
I never knew that it existed until
have you seen it now?
Yeah, you told me to look it up, and I looked it up, and it's a lovely little scene.
I really love it. I think it's really lovely.
They've clearly aged a lot.
But it's fine, because they kind of explain. They certainly explain him aging, because he's like, well, I stopped in the future for ages, so I got old, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Philby would be as old as he is there, because it's World War One. It's only like 20 years later.
Well, it would be 16 years. I think he dies. He dies in 1916, doesn't he? But he comes
16,
back.
yeah.
He comes back, doesn't he? To sort of.
Yeah, he comes back to basically. He comes back like about a week or so before he dies to tell him to come with him. He's like, "Come with me." And of course Philby's not having any of it still. He's like, no, and he goes to destroy the machine, doesn't he? He's like, this machine is my life. Would you take my life? And he's like, no, I can't do it to you, George. But he refuses to come back. He says, he's got obligations to the war, and they talk about how fruitless war is, and he says no, and he declines, and they part as friends again. But I think he says something like, "Oh, he dies on May 5th."
He warns him. He says, "Make sure you're not wherever it is he's supposed to be," sort of thing.
He dies in a plane crash, right?
I can't remember.
I think it's a plane crash in on the 5th of May or something. And he says, "Well, I'll come back on the 4th."
Yeah,
and maybe I can convince him then. And off he goes. But yeah, I thought it was a lovely scene, to be honest. Just
it's a nice little thing. I was really impressed.
Yeah. But yeah, that was the Time Machine. I think is a wonderful adaptation. Obviously, it doesn't cover everything in the book. The budget kind of restricts them somewhat. But
to be honest, it's not even a long book. It's only like 90.
No, it's a novella, isn't it? It's not. It much like War of the Worlds. It's a very short.
Yeah, they're both very short books.
But one of my favorite of Wells, I think War of the Worlds is my favorite. I think War of the Worlds is probably my favorite story of all time, but it's up there. Certainly of Wells's, those are my two favorites. And I think this is a really good adaptation. I think it's great. I think the effects really hold up for the most part. I think it looks really good. I think the acting's superb.
Yeah. I think that's it. The performances are really great. Taylor's great. Mimu's great, and all of the supporting cast, even though it's not a big supporting cast, they're all really good in their little roles.
Yeah.
And I still like the remakes. Got its charm as well.
It's not terrible. Like I said, I have a heavy bias because I grew up with this movie and I love it so much. But you're right, the remake is not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. It's
sometimes the Morlocks look a little janky in the face.
Yes, yeah,
the facial movements, and they did add the weird Jeremy Irons, Elric of Mont de Benet,
yes,
Chief Morlock, which is a bit weird, but there's a real sort of doom-leaden thing about that one, because they add the whole he's trying to save his wife sort of thing. Is it wife or his fiance or whatever it is?
Yeah, because she's dying of something, isn't she?
No, she dies, and he keeps trying to.
Oh no, that's right. Yes, yeah.
Save her, and he realizes that he can't save her. It's got a real sort of doom to it, which is quite cool, actually.
Yeah.
And of course, I don't know whether have you ever seen Time After Time?
No, don't think so.
Oh, you really should see Time After Time. It's 1979. It's a Nicholas Meyer directed movie, and it's Malcolm McDowell as George Wells, and it's David Warner as Jack the Ripper,
right?
And it's got Murray Steenburgen, and basically, so Malcolm McDowell's George Wells is invented a time machine.
Yeah.
And David Warner's Jack the Ripper pinches it and goes to 1970s San Francisco. And
this sounds like it sounds amazing.
It's great. It's really good, and I really love it. And it's basically he gets it and he manages to get the time machine back, or I think he finds it somewhere, and he goes to the future as well, where he meets Mary Steenburgen's character, which is funny because she's got that whole arc, in Back to the Future 3.
Yeah.
Which is like similar but backwards sort of thing.
It sounds very Dracula AD 1972.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
It's really fun, and I really enjoy it. But what I didn't realise, didn't know, is apparently in a couple of years back, ABC made a series of it.
Oh, really? Oh.
They made a new version, but it got cancelled after 5 episodes. So,
Well,
clearly
I will
didn't do
certainly
very
check the
much.
movie out. It does sound fun. I'm
But
surprised
yeah,
I haven't seen it actually.
I recommend the movie. It's a little quirky. It's not as good as Time Machine, but I really love it. I've got a real love for Malcolm McDowell and David Warner. So
I mean, cast wise, that's superb. Yeah.
yeah, and David Warner is the sort of creepy Jack the Ripper is quite cool.
Yeah, cool. Well, in any case, that was 1960s The Time Machine from director George Pal. Wonderful, wonderful film, and highly, highly recommended from both of us. We will be back next week with our usual modern movies. I've seen Nosferatu, and I'm sure we'll find some other things to watch too. But until then, stay safe, take care, and we will catch you next time.